What draft picks do the Indiana Pacers have in the upcoming draft? Well, it's complicated but very important. Could they have good second round picks? What first round picks will they have? And who should you, as a fan, be rooting for the Pacers to have the best draft picks possible in the upcoming draft? The All-Star break, perfect time to dive into all this. And I'll break it all down today on the Locked On Pacers podcast. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we are diving into the Pacers draft pick situation in 2023. The trade deadline is settled. The Pacers picks are owned and settled in the way that they could be, but there's a lot of interesting protections involved. There's a lot of picks in both rounds involved. There's like swaps sort of in there that I want to get to all of, so you can know as a fan who to root for among other NBA teams down the stretch of the season. And there's going to be some complicated stuff in here, and you're going to hear the name of a Purdue big man that you have not heard in a long time on today's show. So I'm going to split this up as first round picks the Pacers have, second round picks the Pacers have, and then rooting interests to close it out. And the first round pick section is mostly easy to cut through, but still worth diving into. First and foremost, the Pacers do own their own first round pick in this upcoming draft. Of course, that is the big one. That is the pick to keep an eye on in their last 22 games of this season. They picked 6th last year, and currently, if there was no lottery and the season ended, they'd be in the 6th slot right now, right? They are behind or the tank-tastic Houston, San Antonio, Detroit, Charlotte group, and right there, 1.5 games away as I'm recording this. I believe there's some games tonight, but from Orlando in the lottery standings for 5th, and then 1 game ahead of the Bulls, 1.5 game ahead of the Lakers in the 7-8 slot. So firmly entrenched currently at 6th with, I would say, reasonable mobility to go into even like the 11-12 range. You know, that's where Portland and Utah sit, but they're closer to 500. I would say a more realistic range would be somewhere between maybe the Wizards and Lakers at 8 and 9, and up as high as Orlando at 5. And the Pacers do not have, have not, no protections there. It's not like they can lose it if things go a certain way. That pick is theirs. They maybe closer to the draft could decide to figure out what they want to do with it, but I don't think any team is trading their lottery pick until the lottery is over. So that is the Pacers' own first round pick. They also have one incoming from the Caris LeVert trade from the Cavs. If you'll recall, in the 2021-22 season, the Pacers made a trade with the Cavs. They got Ricky Rubio, a second-round pick from Houston, and a first-round pick from Cleveland that was lottery protected. Now, in that trade, what ended up happening is the Cavs missed the playoffs. They lost both of their playing games. They had some nasty injuries down the stretch, so they didn't make the playoffs in 2022, which means that pick rolled over to 2023. So the Pacers have that Cavs pick this year. The Houston pick ended up becoming Andrew Nembhard, obviously a slam dunk second rounder. That trade alone without this first round pick would already be a home run for the Pacers, but they also get Cleveland's pick in the first round of the upcoming draft. But it is lottery protected once again. So the Cavs have to make the playoffs for the Pacers to get this pick. Now, currently, things are projecting just fine in that regard. Cleveland currently 4th in the East at 38-23. That's a fantastic record. The Nets are close to them at 34-24. Nets looking pretty good, or at least effective with their new look roster. Mikal Bridges just had a nearly 50-point game for them. But they are 2.5 behind the Cavs, and then the next team is like the Knicks at 33-27, and that's 6th, and they're tied with Miami. I guess they're like half a game apart, and I wouldn't expect, looking at how these teams have played all season, especially considering no major deadline additions. Josh Hart's good, certainly, that Miami or New York would be able to climb all the way ahead of Cleveland and Brooklyn ahead of Cleveland at the same time. As of the time of me recording this, again, the All-Star break technically doesn't start till tomorrow because this is last Thursday. I'm traveling. Doesn't matter. The Cavs have won 8 of their last 10, right? They're playing fantastic basketball right now. If they can continue to play well, there's not that many games left looking at the season. There's only about 20 games left for most teams. It's really hard to make up significant ground. It's really hard for 3 teams to make up significant ground and the Cavs to stumble. They have an all-star. They have two other guys who were all-stars last season, right? They're a talented team. And so when you look at the Cavs situation, is it possible they fall to the plan? Sure. The difference between them and Miami is 5 games. That is, in theory, possible for a team to make up. If you'll recall the bubble season, for example, teams had played something in like the mid 60 games, and the NBA said if you were within 4 games of the final playoff spot, you can come to the bubble because technically you would have had a shot. That's how Phoenix got to go. I think they like scraped in. So like it's within reason in theory, and the NBA has kind of described it that way using the bubble. But I would say highly unlikely, exceedingly unlikely, above 95% chance the Pacers are getting the Cavs pick. The question is, where will it land? They're within 1 game of Memphis. We'll talk about all this stuff in the rooting interest section. There's a couple teams that are close enough to the Cavs, and the Suns have Kevin Durant now, that it could move where it is currently in the first round. But as of right this second, as of me talking about the Pacers' second best first round pick, it's 26th in the upcoming draft. And the Pacers have a third first round pick. 3 first rounders in one draft is unusual for any team. Nonetheless, a Pacers team that typically doesn't go a direction of acquiring a lot of picks throughout their history. That one is from the Boston Celtics. You'll remember that one. They got it last summer in the Malcolm Brogdon trade, which again, like the Cavs trade where the Pacers get Nembhard for LeVert, that already is a pretty good deal. Nesmith for Brogdon is already looking like a great decision from the Pacers, and Tice could turn into something in the future. I have no idea, but they also get this first, right? So that is noteworthy as well. The pick from the Celtics is top 12 protected, meaning if the Celtics miss the playoffs, but they have one of the 2 best records of a team that misses the playoffs, they would then still send the pick to the Pacers. The highest that pick could be is 13. The 13th pick right now is OKC, who's under 500. They're 28-29. That means their peak wins is 53. And the Utah Jazz peak wins, for example, is 51-52 for the Blazers. The Celtics are about they have 42-17, so they're technically 10 games away from that pick guaranteed going to the Pacers, but it's likely going to be less, almost certainly going to be much less than that, considering the teams hovering in the 13-14 range are 500. But the Celtics also could win the lottery if they miss the playoffs. They'd have to fall out of the playoffs entirely, which seems impossible. They are 10 games ahead of Miami and 9.5 games ahead of New York as of me talking right now. And that gap would have to be made up over the final 20 games of the season for the Celtics to be in the play-in, and then they'd have to lose the play-in to not get it. I'm basically going to put this at 100% chance that the Pacers end up with the Celtics pick, almost certainly looking like for a long time this season that it was going to be 30, the final pick in the first round of this draft. But here we go. Here come the Milwaukee Bucks, winners of 11 in a row. And the Celtics still playing great. They've won 7 of their last 10. But you can't hold off the Bucks for forever. Only 1 game ahead of Milwaukee. And Denver's kind of in this mix too. They've been playing fantastic basketball as well. So it's not fait accompli that the Celtics pick ends up being 30. It could move around a little bit at the back end of this first round, and it's certainly going to be one of the bottom 5 picks in the league. The Celtics are fantastic this season. They just permanently made Joe Mazzulla their head coach, but it's not guaranteed to be the worst pick in the first round. So in summary, those are the 3 picks for the Pacers in the first round of the draft. This is the easier part, believe it or not, is the Pacers pick, which is theirs. There's no protections. There's no weirdness. The Cavs pick, which is lottery protected. They just have to make the playoffs. They can even do it via the play-in, but for safety reasons after last year, I think the Pacers would just like them to make it. And then the Celtics pick, which is almost a certainty. Now, remember, the Pacers only have 3 expiring contracts in James Johnson, O'Shea Brissett, and George Hill, and 3 first-rounders plus second-rounders. They're certainly going to trade some draft picks in the future unless they are crazy with their roster in the summer. But knowing the situation for these picks and having them be as good as possible is still ideal for the franchise. And speaking of ideal picks, Pacers could have a very good second rounder. But there's some crazy stuff going on with the Pacers' second round picks and where it could be headed, and it could be great, and it could be kind of crappy. That's the case for a couple of their second rounders. Let's dive in to the Pacers' second round pick situation. But first, hey guys, one short little break here so I could talk to you about FanDuel. It's the midway point of the NBA season, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. They've got it all at FanDuel. The spreads, the money lines, the point totals, player points, rebounds. You get the gist. Exclusive bets like their 2x3, 2 3-pointers scored in the first 3 minutes. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, hop on over to Locked On NBA to hear the latest and greatest news from around the league, hear what's going on at All-Star, and looking ahead at the final stretch of this NBA season. Let's look at the Pacers' second-round picks in this draft. Chaos. Complete chaos is how I would describe the Pacers' second-round pick situation. But let's actually start with the Pacers' own second-round pick because they don't have it. They do not have it. They made a trade with the Spurs, if you'll recall. This is the first trade you should note, with Doug McDermott via a sign-and trade. It was not a real trade. Both teams traded top 55 protected second-round picks back and forth so they could have like a throwaway thing to send to other teams. So in theory, this is possible. If the Pacers rattle off an incredible second half of the season and get to 48 wins and some crazy stuff happens with other teams, the Pacers could have a top 5 record in the league, in which case their second round pick would go to the Spurs. On the exceedingly likely chance that doesn't happen, the Pacers second rounder goes to the Kings. That was a part of the Tyrese Halliburton, Domantas Sabonis trade. So the Pacers do not own their second rounder no matter what. But if they have a top 5 record in the league at the end of the season, it goes to the Spurs. And if they don't have a top 5 record, that will go to the Kings as slated right this second. Their second round pick would go to the Kings at pick number 36. So that is the Pacers' own second. They do not have it, but they do have many other seconds worth discussing. And let's talk about the other side of that trade that I mentioned earlier, the McDermott thing, the Spurs pick, because we can actually cross this one off officially, I believe, as of last night. The Spurs sent, and for those unaware of how this works, the Spurs sent the Pacers a top 55 protected second rounder in the Doug McDermott sign and trade. The Pacers got a trade exception out of that, which is why they did the trade. But teams have to send something in a trade, like draft rights or a top 55 protected second, which just means, they basically sent nothing unless they're a really good team that year. And the Spurs are not a good team. They have 47 losses officially as of this recording. 45 losses as of this recording. Their peak wins is 37, and there's already 5 teams in the league who have more than 37 wins, which means that is guaranteed to not convey. There is no other obligation. So the Pacers will not be getting the Spurs second rounder. We can cross over that part of this discussion and talk about the picks the Pacers actually do have instead of the ones that they don't. And the big one that everyone is interested in, which could be a fantastic pick depending on how things break, is this crazy thing with the Houston Rockets. So I guess I'll just read it as I can find it to you, and then I'll try to make it make more sense. So I promise there's a lot of teams involved here, but bear with me. So the Pacers will be getting a second-round draft pick from one of these 3 teams: the Houston Rockets, the Dallas Mavericks, or the Miami Heat. 2 of those teams, playoff teams, are good. One of them, one of the worst teams in the league, and could be a great pick. The Oklahoma City Thunder will get the better of Dallas or Miami second rounders, no matter what. But the other part of this, between the worst of Miami and Dallas's and the Houston pick, is a little complicated. If the Rockets' second round pick is 33 or worse, then the Rockets pick goes to the Celtics, and the Pacers get the worst of Dallas or Miami's second rounders because the best one went to the Thunder. But if the Rockets pick is 31 or 32, it's protected in that range, then it goes to the Pacers. If it's in the protected range, it goes to Indiana, which is very, very confusing, I'm aware. But that is how this all sort of has shaken out. So what does that mean for the Pacers? They would like the Rockets to finish with one of the worst 2 picks in the league. And it's possible that, I guess, Boston could convey something to Indiana in this trade. It's very confusing. And how did this happen? What is the situation that led to this? Well, for all these picks to be involved with 3 different teams, lots of trades had to be made in the past. This started with the Heat sent this 2023 second rounder to Dallas, along with Josh McRoberts for AJ Hammonds in a salary dump. That was in 2017 is when this started. The Mavs second round pick that got involved in this, not the Heat one, was involved when Daylon Wright got signed and traded from Dallas to Memphis in 2019. And the Thunder and Rockets trade part of this happened when Jordan Bell got traded from the Grizzlies from the Rockets to the Grizzlies, and Bruno Caboclo got traded to the Rockets. I might have those teams backwards, but a second round pick was swapped there as well. So these are really old trades, and the Pacers got looped in the old Depot trade a few years ago. But these picks got all sent around in a million different ways, and so the Pacers end up with either the 31st or 32nd pick, and if it's not that, then it becomes either Dallas or Miami's second rounder. So as of right now, they would get Houston's pick, which is 31, the best pick in the second round. But it's not the records of those teams in the second round between Detroit and San Antonio and Charlotte are not that far away. So it's important for the Pacers, at least they'll hope that the Rockets will remain bad. We'll talk about that in the second segment because as it stands, Dallas' second rounder 48th and Miami's second rounder 51st. Way worse, right? So ideally, especially because the Celtics would get it and they're fantastic, the Pacers would like the Rockets to be awful. Again, we'll talk about the rooting interests in the final segment here, but that is one second rounder the Pacers are getting from one of those three teams in some way, depending on the final standings between Houston, Dallas, and Miami, and potential obligations involved elsewhere in that trade. It's pretty wild that it shook out that way. Two draft night trades in 2020 made it flip around, and the Depot deal, it's just nuts. There is another second rounder heading to the Pacers from the Bucks trade that happened last week. From this Bucks trade that happened last week is what I was going to say. Fascinating that there's another second rounder potentially headed to the Pacers. And it, once again, is confusing and features some funky protections and things like that. So the Bucks sent their best second rounder to the Pacers. That is the simplest way I can describe what I'm about to say. The Bucks have an extra second rounder in their cabinet from a trade they made with the Clippers last year. And the Clippers got the second rounder from the Cavs, and it was a swap with the Warriors. And this is not what we're talking about. There's a lot of backstory to all these random second rounders that get flung around. But either way, the Pacers get the best Bucks second rounder. But that doesn't happen to be a very good pick. What that pick is it is the best of the following. It is either going to be the Bucks pick or, and this is one pick, but this sounds like two teams, the worst of the Cavaliers and Warriors second rounders, right? So the Bucks get that thing, whatever the worst two of the Cavs and Warriors is, which currently slates to be the Cavs pick, will be worse, right? So the Cavs second rounder currently slated to be 56. And ironically, Tankathon has them picking Zach Edey from Purdue. And Golden State's second rounder slots in at 45, right? So the worst of those is the Cavs pick. The Bucks would get that, but then the Pacers get the best of either that Cavs pick or the Bucks' own second rounder, which is currently 59, although technically it's 57 because there's two forfeited second rounders. So the Pacers from this Bucks trade, the best case scenario is like the Warriors and Cavs get merged closer, but either way, those three teams, because it's the worst of the Cavs and Warriors, are in the back of the second round. Like that pick at best probably ends up 52-ish, pretty late in the second round. Again, considering the Pacers roster situation, that might be a two-way player or just a pick that's not made at all. But it is something coming to the Pacers in this upcoming 2023 draft. It is the best of those two things, whether that's the Bucks pick or the worst of the Warriors and the Cavs picks. And so, as my old boss used to say, clear as mud. Very confusing, certainly, stuff going on in this second round, and trades dating back 6 years make this fascinating, right? And it's just wild that this Houston thing is what it is. I think that is the key storyline of the second round to watch for the Pacers is, do they get a really great second rounder again? Those picks are really valuable because not only are you getting, like, the 30th pick is a first round pick and the 31st pick is a second round pick, and the perception difference there is enormous, but the talent difference isn't. You can see that with Andrew Nembhard this year, who's in the Rising Stars game, right? You can get a good player in the top of the second round with one of those picks, but the drop from 32 to the mid 40s or the 50s even is the difference between getting, Andrew Nembhard, who is on a steal of a deal for the next 3 or 4 seasons and looks to be a key part of the Pacers core, versus getting, a two-way contract guy that, maybe could become something, right? Jokic is picked in the 40s. The Pacers have had success with their second rounders. They've actually been under Pritchard, a pretty good second round drafting team between Sumner and Alizé Johnson and Nembhard and a couple more mixed in there. E. County Bogu looked like he had some promise for a second. You could go on and on. They are valuable picks, but obviously you prefer that's as close to the first round as possible, especially because the Pacers, they can't pick as many picks as they have, most likely. So trading up or trading out is important. And if those picks are higher value, you get better stuff for it. So the second round, very confusing, and I will try to make it simplified in this final segment, talking about the rooting interests of the Pacers down the stretch of the season with 20-something games to go. What should Pacers fans want from other teams in the league to make their draft positions as strong as possible? Let's finish that show and talking about that. But first, thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Basketball with Josh Lloyd. If you need fantasy basketball help, Josh Lloyd is the guy for you. He's helped me a ton in the past when I actually played fantasy basketball, which was years ago at this stage, but he's fantastic at it. He's the best, and he can help you out with anything you may need on that front. Let's conclude today with what I'm calling the rooting interest section for Pacers fans. What teams do they want to do well down the stretch of the season? What teams should they want to do poorly down the stretch of the season so that their draft picks can be as good as possible? Now, I'll start with kind of an elephant in the room of this, and that's the Pacers themselves. I don't care what you root for on the Pacers front. Some fans are and always will be pro tank when the team isn't as good as possible, and some fans want to see their team win every game. I'm not going to tell you what to root for or how to fan. That's not my job. But the Pacers, root for them to do whatever you want. That's how fandom works. But remember, if they do well, they could make the postseason, get valuable postseason experience. Winning is fun. Fans love that. And if you're on the other side, remember that people like high draft picks, and Benedict Mathurin has been awesome. There's good value in both of those. But other teams, it's much more clear how this should be rooted for. If you're rooting for the Pacers, starting with like the obvious ones, the first round picks they have, the Cavs and Celtics. If you're a Pacers fan, you want those teams to do very poorly down the stretch of this season. Not so poorly that they miss the playoffs, because then the Pacers would lose the picks, but poorly enough that they go higher. For example, in the Cavs case, like I said, Memphis is one game behind them in the standings right now. So if you're a Pacers fan, would like the Cavs to do worse than the Grizzlies down the stretch of the season, because then that pick could go up to 25. Or Brooklyn or the Kings are, 4 games behind the Cavs. And Phoenix, who just got Kevin Durant, is 5 games behind the Cavs. Like I said, that's a massive 5 games with 20 games to go is a massive, massive, massive gap, but it's not impossible, right? So if you're a Pacers fan, I would say you're rooting against the Cavs, and in turn, that means you're kind of rooting for the Grizzlies, and depending on the Eastern Conference, other stuff for the Kings, for the Suns, for the Nets, so that Cavs pick can maybe get up to that 23, 22 range and be as valuable as possible come draft time. And you can apply the exact same logic to the Celtics. It's not just about rooting against the Celtics if you're a Pacers fan, although technically it is, because the worse they are, the better that pick becomes. But it's also about the teams that are within reach of them in theory in the standings doing well, so that they pass the Celtics. For example, Milwaukee is 1 game behind the Pacers, although that one's confusing because the Pacers have the Bucks second rounder, but the first round pick's more valuable. So the Bucks doing poorly and the Bucks passing them is good for the Pacers. The Nuggets are 1 game behind them in this mix as well. If the Nuggets do well down the stretch or do better than the Celtics, then that pick could go up to 28. The Sixers are close enough, 3 games away, striking distance, I suppose. That is also the case. And the Sixers are the team immediately on the other side of the Cavs, where if the Sixers do better than the Cavs, that's good for the Pacers. So really, the Sixers doing well is something the Pacers significantly want, as well as the Bucks. So those teams, Philly, Denver, Milwaukee, Pacers fans would like to be good, and the Celtics, they would like to be bad. That would maximize their first round pick situation. If you are rooting for the Pacers pick to be as high as possible, I would say one team to root for would be the Orlando Magic, who are 1.5 games away from the Pacers, currently in the inverse standings. Pacers could get up to 5 in that way. Pacers are 9 games away from the 4th pick. That's just not feasible at all, so it doesn't matter on that end. And, the Bulls, Lakers, Wizards, Raptors are teams that people who want the Pacers pick to be as high as possible should be rooting for. A couple of those teams, in fact, all of them except the Bulls, basically tried to get better at the trade deadline this year, and all of them are playing close to 500 or better than 500 basketball in their last 10 games. So we'll see where that shakes out. But those are teams to even if you want the Pacers to win the rest of the season, wanting those teams to win as well would still maximize the Pacers draft pick in the first round in this upcoming draft. So I suppose on either side of the fence on where your Pacers rooting interest is, you should still be rooting for those teams in turn so that the Pacers can move up, especially so with the West teams, right? With the Lakers, with the Portland, so that, if you want the Pacers to be in the playoffs or cheer for them as much as you can, their pick can still be as solid as possible. Utah, I guess, in theory, in that mix as well, because they're only 3 games away from the Pacers. So those teams are all kind of really tough to kind of figure out. because, again, it depends on your Pacers rooting interest, but that is also another aspect of this. Now, this Houston pick makes things really, really confusing because Pacers fans should want that pick to be want the Rockets to have one of the worst 2 records in the league. Now, the tricky part of this is the worst 3 records all have the same lottery odds. So there's no value for the Rockets. There's no difference in value for the Rockets fitting with the worst record, the second worst record, or the third worst record. And that last one is where the Pacers will go, oh, that stinks that it's 33 if that were to happen. And so, from a Pacers perspective, obviously rooting against the Rockets is a key part of this, right? The Rockets, and they've had the worst record in the league, I think 2 years in a row. They currently have the worst record in the league. So rooting against them is something the Pacers should certainly want. They currently have a 13-45 record and have lost 7 straight games, but there's other teams in the mix as well. It's not just about rooting against the Rockets. It's also the Spurs, who are half a game away in the standings. The Spurs have lost 14 games in a row. I don't know when they'll next win, but the Spurs could end up with the worst record, certainly, right? So the Pacers fans should want the Spurs to win games, right? So they get farther from the Rockets. The Pistons, same kind of deal. The Pistons, 15-44, 1.5 games away from the worst record. They've lost 2 in a row, but they've won 3 of their last 10, right? Pacers fans should want them to win so that they get away from the Rockets in the standings. The Charlotte Hornets, they've actually won 2 games in a row. They have an all-star talent in LaMelo Ball on their team. It seems like it'll be hardest for them to drop in the standings, but Pacers fans should, again, want them to win so that they can't get down to the Rockets level to close out this season. So ideally for the Pacers, the Rockets have one of the 2 worst records in the league at the end of this. But the incentive for the Rockets is they don't have their second rounder anyway, right? So they just care about being one of the worst 3 teams. And it's always valuable to be as high as possible in theory based on coin flips and where you end up after things happen. So, they still have some value in being the worst, number one. But, the Pacers will certainly hope that the Rockets end up as low as possible and that those other teams stay above them. And the Spurs just being miserable means that's probably the trickiest one. But Detroit is kind of the swing team there, right? If Detroit can be a little bit better than the Rockets down the stretch, that would be wonderful news for the Pacers. Any team near Cleveland, I think, I kind of already went through this, but a team worth rooting for if you want the Pacers picks to be good. So Memphis, Sacramento, even Phoenix and New York in this mix is a team that Pacers fans should be rooting for just so that pick can be as good as possible. And then the Milwaukee second rounder is kind of the trickiest one because it's the worst of the Cleveland Golden State one. And then on the flip side, the better with the Milwaukee pick in there as well. So the best that could be is like if somehow Cleveland just tanks poorly. So again, that's just the same thing as the first round pick, which is rooting against Cleveland. But theoretically, if Milwaukee has just like an awful down the stretch of the season, they could get above the Cavs. But at the same time, Milwaukee doing well means they could pass Boston in the standings, and you prefer your first round pick be better than your second round pick, of course. So I think the Pacers fans should still be rooting for, just so that the first round pick the Pacers have would be better in theory. But there is some pros to the second rounder being a tiny bit better, I suppose, in this situation. But that, again, is just the Cavs. And like the Warriors would have to be good for that to even be thought about differently. And they're so far away from this that it doesn't even matter. They're currently in the lottery, technically, at 14th. They're in the play-in tournament, which sort of muddies the waters. So there's a lot of rooting interests here. There's very few teams that the Pacers just don't care about, like New Orleans and Atlanta and Dallas and Minnesota, kind of these middle-of-the-road West teams. The Pacers are kind of like, you know what? They don't affect us too much in the draft standings. But there's a lot of layers to this, and because the Pacers have a really interesting upcoming draft situation with their expiring contracts and picks, and because they have so many weird protections and kind of swap stuff in here, there's a lot of weird ways this could go that are worth monitoring for the Pacers down the stretch. I think starting in March, I did this last season, we'll do it again. We'll do standings watch once a week, right? How did the things go for the Pacers last week in terms of their spot in the standings and teams they care about spot in the standings, what to watch for this coming week, etc., just so we can always have a good pulse on where this is headed. If you have questions about this, hit me up on Twitter at TEastNBA. And if you want to ask questions of the podcast, at Locked On Pacers is the way to go. Hope you guys enjoyed All-Star stuff. I'm recording this before All-Star, so perhaps this gets pushed back a day or something if something happens in the future we're talking about. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and learned a lot, because there's a lot to know about the Pacers' upcoming draft. Thank you guys so much for listening. Have a fantastic day. We will see you tomorrow.